Alright guys, in this section we're going to cover the difference between timepieces and watches. We're going to look at different movements, what it means to really, what is a real timepiece, what are some of the things you're looking for. If you are very familiar with watches already, meaning you already collect or you're very familiar with the different models, this is probably a section you can just skip over. There's nothing here that's going to be of value to you that you don't already know. However, for those of you that are new to the watch industry in general or who are not very well versed or have not owned a lot of watches before, perhaps this is going to be an interesting section to teach you a little bit of everything. So, this is the important thing is we see in this slide here, and I forgot to tell you this, but you have the Audemars Piguet here, the Panerai and the Rolex. The thing with timepieces is that it's about the craftsmanship inside, and it's about the history and the way watchmakers used to make watches and how that's evolved over time. So each movement almost has its own unique following as much as the outside designs, etc. The common public typically buys on the outside. The connoisseurs buy for the movements, the rarity, or how long it takes a good craftsman to really make the watch, etc. So the exclusivity is what they really buy. Now, if we look here, there's just some 3 examples of timepieces. The more common Submariner Rolex there on your right-hand side, the submersible Panerai. This is a very unique and awesome edition, 1950 Carbotech. And then a very common Audemars Piguet on stainless steel bracelet of a Royal Oak offshore. These are like very popular and common kind of high-end watches, and I don't necessarily mean these models, I mean these 3 brands. There's a lot more we're going to cover, but just you'll see that there's a significant trend to the way they look. So if you look at like each particular brand has its own respective kind of design elements, between kind of the Panerai has this crown protector around, you can see this thing that says RAG on it right on the corner, it protects the crown. Audemars Piguet has that octagon thing, and then Rolex has that bezel that's really they're famous for. So each brand has its own trademarks that kind of makes it kind of popular and more obvious to the common public. Now that's exactly what I was talking about here. You can kind of see the difference again on 3 similar models. It all depends on, once again, on your ability to decipher this in the long run. Just getting familiar with models and what, automatically recognizing models also allows you to recognize knockoffs or cheaper watches trying to do design elements of the similar fashion. Now, this is a good example of what I was just talking about. Like if you look at the Audemars Piguet here, which you can see on your left-hand side, and right next to you see a Tommy Hilfiger watch. Again, one costs like $2 to make and is selling retail for like $300. The other one is, has taken someone like 6-7 months to put together and is going to be selling for like 20 grand. The Audemars Piguet versus the Hilfiger, you can see that the I guess design elements that these cheaper manufacturers are trying to steal from kind of what has worked for some of these big names. Now, what's really funny is that Rolex Submariner design is one of the most copied designs, on earth by many manufacturers, many of which were actually credible people, meaning they're credible watch companies. They're just not very good. I mean, they create garbage, but nonetheless, they're credible as in they have a pretty big retail presence out there. So Invicta being one of those, look at the design element, like kind of copycatting this, even though they're not even, like I understand they're not saying it's a Rolex, but take a look at the bezel. Like they even have all of the little dots and the little markers between the 0 and the 15. You see like completely marked similarly. So like when you're not trying to copy, then why are you building kind of the same looking watch? So even the writing in the dial, you see the 4 lines, again 4 lines, so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of necessarily copycats, but these are not fakes. These are just like a good example of what a timepiece is versus a watch. So it really comes down to what's on the inside, because if you look at the outside right here, it would seem that, especially on the Rolex Invicta front, that they're very, very similar. So the common naked person that doesn't understand watches isn't going to be able to decipher, like a design like this. So if someone wanted a really nice looking Rolex-like watch and couldn't afford it, Well, here's a good example of what you should buy instead of a fake. Like an Invicta that gives you that look without the cost associated with it. But again, I don't recommend you buying Invicta for any given reason at any given time. So there are different types of movements, and we're going to kind of review them because I want you to understand what they mean and why the prices change a lot. So there's the quartz movement, the automatic movement, which comes in both the mechanical as well as the automatic. And then there's the chronographs, the GMTs, and the tourbillons. So we're going to look at some of these more popular ones so we understand what that means. The quartz movement is one of the, I would say, very, very accurate older movements. Again, it has a battery, so meaning a quartz watch works on a battery that powers it, and as a result of the battery, it's typically pretty accurate and consistent in its function. It's very typically quartz watches are much cheaper, and either are still in some of the modern day watches due to size, meaning a lot of women's watches are still quartz because the automatic counterparts would not fit in the size of the smaller end watch for women's wrist. This is not all manufacturers, just saying that many manufacturers who are having very upscale, complicated movements for men are still offering quartz movement for their woman line. So it's something good to kind of know. These don't have as much of a following in terms of collector value, just because the engineering and the craftsmanship was very early on, meaning it didn't have much of an edge or uniqueness to it other than it just functioned properly. So, it's just something to consider and understand about the quartz movement. It's a battery-powered movement, fairly on the cheaper side of things, and can be duplicated for pennies on the dollar in China. The mechanical movement, this is one that I personally like a lot. There's a lot of watches that require you to wind them, meaning you have to wind them so that the power reserve actually functions. Now, this is an upgrade from a quartz watch, and it's a very similar model to the automatic. You wind it, you wear it on your wrist, the movement keeps it alive, and then eventually when the power dies, you wind it again and gain more power. Most of them have about 40 hours of reserve power, meaning 40 hours of time where it's not on your wrist, there's no motion, and yet still doesn't require a wind up. So it's something to just consider that mechanical watches are ultimately a side of what automatic watches are to begin with. And again, the important thing here in mechanical is they're not battery powered. That means there's no replacement of battery, just winding will pretty much shift the way you got energy from the battery to just the motion. The tourbillon movements, this is something that is very complex, meaning that it's something, the more complex it becomes, the more expensive it becomes. The thing with tourbillons is there's a lot of fake tourbillons, like fake look-alike tourbillons, but real tourbillons are extremely, extremely expensive. I mean, we're talking about watches that are in the $200-300K range, brand new, and are very desirable by high-end collectors that can actually afford to buy them. Tourbillons will depreciate like everything else once they're new, but this is something important to consider, that a watch is only as good as what someone's willing to pay for it, especially when it's very low volume, no different than a very rare exotic car. The cool thing with the tourbillon movement is that it aims to try to counterweight the effects of gravity in general, which sounds insane, right? But someone actually designed this in the watch, and you can really see the intricate details of what a movement that's tourbillon looks like. So, we talked a little bit, and I showed you the difference between watches and timepieces. Let's define what really is a timepiece, versus a watch. It's the actual metals used, meaning like you could have real gold, real stainless steel, of course, and in many cases white gold, silver, platinum, etc. So real metals, right? Because watches, and not timepieces, but watches and fakes don't use real gold, even if they imitate gold with a plaqued gold kind of setting. So a lot of these high-end watches, especially these tourbillons, etc., take a watchmaker a long time to make. Meaning there's some cases of certain watches taking one person like over a year to make. And that's what you're buying. You're buying that effort, that passion, that drive, rather than just buying how cool it looks on your wrist, right? it's not just a status thing at that point. It's a connoisseur and concept that's about understanding, like the heritage and the history of the brand and why it's worth something. The functionality can differentiate again because you don't have real tourbillon watches. You have real tourbillon timepieces. Because, fake watches obviously may have something that looks like tourbillon, but it doesn't function for the reality of what it is. And then, just so that you understand in general, the innovation it isn't necessarily innovative to tell time, but the way time is told. There's a lot of watches that are very unique in their approach of design as well as functionality, and that's where this innovation concept comes in. So, let's look briefly at what is considered a retail watch. Again, retail watches, this is important because retail watches are watches sold in your department stores, amongst other places. But this is important to understand because if you go to Macy's, for example, you're not going to find real watches. If a watch is being sold in Macy's, it's probably not the type of watch you can make money on, and it's probably not the type of watch that's going to be bringing you more dollars than you actually put into the watch. So, brands that are in the main stores, commercial brands, the retail guys, there's just a lot of volume and a lot of distribution. That's typically what, a retail watch is. The movement's usually quartz or some really cheap Japanese automatic, which gives the false sense of an automatic movement, but yet is a very low quality garbage product. So, a lot of designers like Gucci, Louis Vuitton, will put their names on watches. Like Michael Kors is a good example of using fossil watches and just changing up the dial and just adding their name and then upselling like 200 more than should be worth. So, this is kind of the same thing here. It's the important thing is to understand what actually is a retail watch versus an actual timepiece. Here again, you can see some examples of watches you would find in a Macy's or in a mall, Invicta, Belova, Fossil, Seiko. There are different levels of Seiko, meaning I know Seiko has expensive watches too. But typically, if a watch is sold in the stores in the mall and it does have a bigger, higher end version of it, it's still a bad bet because it doesn't mean that the higher end version is garbage or a bad watch. It simply means that the higher end version won't be holding as much because the line or the watch manufacturer offers lines all the way from the cheap all the way to the high quality. And typically people who spend big money on high end watches do so, like I said earlier, for the heritage and not just the status. And so it's definitely hard for them to buy into a brand that makes a watch as cheap as, a few bucks to be sold in retail stores. This is a good example here of the Michael Kors thing I was talking about. Look at the Fossil watch and then look at the Michael Kors watch. Again, the key here is not that they're just the same color, is that Fossil manufactures Michael Kors watches. So, if Fossil is making watches and selling for 80 to 100 bucks, they're selling the same counterpart with a Michael Kors logo for like 2 to 3 times as much. So this is a good way to understand watches and to understand how little value retail watches have, especially designer watches, because they're not really designer watches. They're just garbage that someone put a new name on and just repackaged and sold. So these are the typical common brands you may see commercially. Now, I understand some of these could go into the other side, meaning, we're talking about Invicta, Tag, Hamilton, Rado, Raymond Wells, Seiko, Breitling, and Rolex. And I know many of you may say that Breitling and Rolex are high-end watches. And while I agree with you, I completely agree that Rolex makes some incredible timepieces, and so does Breitling, especially my favorite is one of the Navitimers I used to own, one of the most beautiful watches ever. But at the end of the day, they're still more commercial than anything else. So they're the ones that are kind of borderline. Rolex is too big of a following to matter as far as what they do. But, when it comes to some of these other brands, you can clearly see that these are the brands sold in Macy's and so on and so forth. Now, on the other hand, in the boutique life, meaning in real watch territory, which is real boutique timepieces, these are just some examples of the type of brands you may see, Patek Philippe, Panerai, Hublot, Ulysse, Snap-on, Blancpain, all of which are, incredible, incredible brands. But there's many, many more. And again, we're going to kind of go through that as we go through the modules. But yet, this is just an example of what you would consider boutique timepiece. Not just because of price, but by the limitation in numbers, as well as the accessibility through the boutiques themselves, because there's so few